Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. If you're in Hanoi, I know we're experiencing the lockdown. If you're watching from another location, I'm glad you've tuned in today, and hopefully this is going to be a blessing for you as we continue our devotional reading through Holy Week. The format is I'm going to give you the passages to read. Please take time to read these. Today we have a little bit more, so you're going to probably want to give more time. And also, I'm going to then, after, just share a couple thoughts on the passage that's hopefully going to jumpstart your thinking. Maybe you're going to want to study a little bit more on the passage. And then there's a discussion question to let your heart kind of ponder the text and reflect on this in a more personal way. Well, in Jesus's last days, today, Holy Tuesday, would have been March 31st, AD 33. Today, the conflict is going to really escalate and intensify. Hit the pause button now and read Mark chapter 11, 20 to 26, and then join me again. Well, the lights go on for Peter. He remembered. Mark tells us as he passed by the tree, he says, "Rabbi, look, the withered tree." Jesus now goes into teaching mode and he gives the lesson. He says, "Have faith in God." Now remember, the context is in the light of the coming judgment of Israel. Yesterday, the cursing of the tree and the clearing of the temple. And so it's kind of like Jesus is saying, hey, you'll be safe if you have this kind of enduring faith in God. In other words, don't put your hope in what you thought the kingdom would look like, or don't hope in the Jewish laws and regulations, or don't hope in your position as disciples, but have faith that is grounded in God alone. Now, often we can use this passage as kind of like a guarantee to get whatever you want from Jesus. Just ask and believe. But God says that he will grant what is in his line of his will, that is not violating his nature. This is not a chance for a self-serving prayer to get what you want. Now, consider why in Jesus' last week on earth does he emphasize believing in prayer? Well, he's pointing out enduring faith believes God works in his timing. Remember, the disciples in the coming days and years, there would be great opposition of the gospel. So they must have enduring faith that is trusting that God can accomplish that which seems impossible for man. Now notice what is surprising, what Jesus says next. Take care of relationships with others. If you have anything against anyone, forgive him. In other words, if you have a grudge or conflict, make it right. You see, you can't ask for God's forgiveness while refusing to forgive others. This simply reveals that you have no appreciation for the mercy you've received. And so as we move to the cross on Friday, Jesus reminds us that prayer involves not only enduring faith, but a faith that involves forgiveness. Be honest, in your life, have you ever noticed this? That you can separate having faith in Jesus and how you treat other people in your life. It's very easy to separate those, but Jesus connects them together. His last week on earth, he wants his disciples to know that a forgiving spirit is evidence that a heart has been made right with God. And remember, what makes Jesus' words here so powerful? It's the timing. Jesus himself is up against his enemies who want to kill him. And he demonstrates forgiveness and reconciliation are at the very center of God's will. Enduring faith is what lets a disciple face the opposition and the conflict to the gospel then and today in our world. Now, Tuesday here, Jesus is going to travel again into Jerusalem, and I want to warn you, this is a longer chunk of text that you need to read through. He's going to describe the temple controversy. So hit the pause button on Mark 11 into chapter 12, verse 44, and then rejoin me again. Now, I know that's a lot of reading in this section. I just want to survey it. And did you notice, though, as you were reading, the tension really builds here? Jesus enters the temple. He's confronted by the leaders. Mark 11, he says, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do these things?" You see, the leaders had all the authority. Jesus had no authority to do any of this. And I love what Jesus does here. He turns things around. He says, "I'll answer you if you answer me first." He says, "What was John's baptism from heaven or from men? Answer me."
You see, they can't answer his simple question. You see, option one, if John was from God, well, he testified about Jesus. And so following John meant you had to follow Jesus. If John was just a normal man, option two, well, then the Jews would be outraged because they held John in such a high esteem and he was honored in the eyes of a Jew. And so Jesus kind of puts them in their place with this parable. Moving on, he then, this parable points out the religious leaders. They were the evil tenants. They were the ones abusing the servants. In the parable, the vineyard owner stands for God and he destroys the evil tenants. This is a symbol of God's judgment on the unrighteous leaders. And they get the meaning because they want to arrest him. And then what happens, they try to trap Jesus. They send the Pharisees to him, the law keepers of Judaism, and they try a trick question. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? You see, if he says yes, well, the people will be disappointed because they'll say, hey, this isn't the Messiah who's going to defeat Roman rule. And their expectations would be shattered and angry at him. If he says no, well, then he'd be guilty of provoking a revolt against Roman rule. Jesus cleverly sidesteps their trap with the brilliant answer. He says, hey, as long as Caesar is in power, pay taxes to him. He's saying, hey, since we're made in God's image, give God the things that are God's. And they're amazed at his answer. You see, what concerned Jesus was, were they giving their entire lives to God? And then another group comes on the scene, the Sadducees. Now you need to know, they didn't believe in the resurrection in the end times. This is different from the Pharisees. Now their question really is just designed to make Jesus' belief in the resurrection look quite ridiculous. Again, with a clever response to his opponents, he says, hey, God is the God of the living and not the dead. Then the experts in the law come on the scene and they try to catch Jesus off guard with a hard theological Bible question. They say, which of God's commands is the greatest? Jesus quotes the Shema from Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19, and he says, he calls for love of God and love of others. And then he goes on the offense and he begins teaching, and his opponents, they can't respond to Jesus' teaching. Now at this point on Tuesday, what's happened? Well, Jesus has continued to expose the inability of the religious leaders to answer his questions. Each group has come and tried to give Jesus their best shot. And they just simply want to eliminate Jesus. They don't want his truth. They just want to trap him. Jesus continues to critique the religious leaders, calling them hypocrites and blind guides, and he's come to really overthrow their authority and replace it with his own. Now, the last event on Tuesday comes from Mark 13. You can read it later because it's quite long. Jesus predicts the future. This is paralleled in Matthew 24 and 25. It's much longer there. But let me just briefly summarize this for you. Jesus leaves the temple in the evening, and on the disciples, as they leave on the way out, they're just awestruck with how impressive the temple is. It would have looked like something like this. They were fascinated by the size, the wonder, the beauty of the complex. Remember, this is the largest structure in the ancient world at the time. An enormous building project by Herod the Great, who started it, 3 to 4 decades earlier. And there, as they're going out, Jesus makes this staggering statement. He said, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here or another that will not be thrown down. And they respond, when, Jesus? What will be the sign? And when are these things going to be accomplished? Jesus then gives this very long answer. It's called the Olivet discourse. It's really beyond the scope of our time today. But he gave this discourse, this teaching, maybe at this kind of location, or today it looks like this, standing from the Mount of Olives. But on one hand, Jesus gives instructions concerning the destruction of Jerusalem that would happen in roughly 40 years by the Romans when they would come to destroy Jerusalem. But on the other hand, Jesus is talking about the far future, the second coming at the end of the age. You see, basically, the destruction of Jerusalem, it is a kind of picture of the worldwide divine judgment that will one day come upon the earth at Christ's return. So the main theme here, chapter 13, is that followers of Jesus then and today will experience increasing persecution and tribulation that will lead up to the final day of judgment. Jesus says here, disciples must remain watchful, vigilant, and persist in faith. Jesus teaching that disciples will enter a world of conflict up against those who are against Jesus' authority and the proclamation of the gospel. The end of Tuesday, a full day with Jesus and the religious officials filled with controversy. What does this all mean for us here, Easter season 2020? As I reflect on today's events, I'm just reminded that Jesus spoke to his disciples with a sense of urgency. Did you notice that as we went through all of the accounts today? And as we continue to go through a season of uncertain days of pandemic and global crisis, why not take Jesus' words to heart with a great sense of urgency this year, this time? Here's some discussion questions for you to work through with your family or individually. Number one, is there anyone in your life you have a grudge, a resentment, or a conflict with? How can you make it right between you and them today to obey Jesus? I think in this time of pandemic, I realize life can change so quickly. Why not keep a short account with those people in your life? Number two, Jesus warned disciples not to be spiritually relaxed, but to devote ourselves to doing what God has given us to do. What does that look like for you right now? To live being watchful, prayerful, to anticipate God to work here in your life in Hanoi? Are you ready to give a defense, to give an answer to those who ask, why do you believe in the cross? How has that changed your life? Church, I believe in times of crisis, if we look at history, people in these times are searching for answers and spiritually hungry. They want to make sense of this life that is, clearly we are in a fallen world and people want answers. Live with an expectation for an opportunity to give an answer to the hope that you have inside of you. See you tomorrow in Holy Week for Wednesday. Make sure to continue to pray through the 40-day of prayer guide. Keep checking in on one another, having those Skype calls, those Zoom calls, and keep looking upward and onward as we progress into Holy Week. See you tomorrow.